Everything changed in that moment. My world blew up. My parents divorced. My dad left the church and left it for another woman. That started as a teenager, really a pretty early addiction to pornography.
When I was growing up, the idea of finding the perfect man, having the perfect marriage, my white knight.
The truth of the physical affair came out, and that betrayal, actually, that it was the same day, it was that night that I shared that with her.
Welcome to Pure Passion. My name is David Kyle Foster, and I'm your host for today's program. You know, many marriages today are in trouble because of sex. In many cases, husbands are living double lives, playing the devoted husband by day and surfing the web for illicit pornography by night. Eventually, some of those men play out their fantasies by using prostitutes or having affairs. And in many cases, the wife doesn't have a clue that any of this is going on. On today's program, we're going to feature the testimony of just such a married couple. He was successful, church-going, and by all appearances was a knight in shining armor for his wife. Sadly, however, much more was going on than met the eye. He was addicted to pornography and eventually entered into an extramarital affair. Today we're going to hear from Bob and his wife Heidi as they tell the story of hidden sexual sin and brokenness and what God can do to bring healing and restoration to a marriage that by all appearances should have failed.
When I was 7, my dad was called into the ministry, and we moved from an affluent neighborhood to a small cottage parsonage right next door to the church, hundreds of miles from my friends and my childhood, and into a whole new environment. From 7 to 12, Dad wasn't around much. He gave his life to the ministry, and I didn't see him much. And our house was a home where there was a lot of chaos, a lot of inner chaos, and the rules of the house were that what is said here stays here, and it didn't cross the lawn to the church next door. At church, we put on our happy faces, and everything was okay. And at age 12, on one Saturday morning, Dad set the family down and said, "I'm leaving your mother." And everything changed in that moment. My world blew up. My parents divorced. My dad left the church and left it for another woman. And I learned in those early years really to separate whatever I was feeling inside from who I needed to be in order to be okay with myself, with the people around me. That started as a teenager, really a pretty early addiction to pornography. Fantasy and masturbation became a part of my life, a place that I could always go. I explored alcohol and partying with friends, and yet when all of that came out and I needed to be the good boy and stand up and be responsible, I could always go back to my fantasy as a place to really medicate my wounds, if you will.
When I was growing up, the idea of finding the perfect man, having the perfect marriage, my white knight. I was in search of my white knight, and I expected to have the perfect wedding, then the perfect marriage. We'd be close, we'd have beautiful children, there would be no fighting, no discourse. I mean, every girl's dream. And there was a short time where I thought I had that.
Through high school and college, my acting out became acting in, and I performed less outside and felt more distant from God inside because I was two different people. I was actually a graduating college senior, and then becoming a husband, which I had hoped would take care of my issue with my sexual addiction, and things were actually going well for me. I started working hard. We had a couple of children, and my life started to look like things were really going well. Yet inside, I continued to, anytime I faced my pain and needed to get away from that, I would always would fall back on fantasy, and that was a place where I could be comforted and run away from my problems.
I was 22 when we got married, and we were married for about 3 years before we found out we were pregnant with our first child. And then, it seemed like those first 3 years were really great. We both worked, we spent time together, and just the excitement of expecting a new baby then, after 3 years, it was an exciting time. And it just seemed like everything was going the way it was supposed to, the way I had dreamed it to be.
Nobody knew. I had no men that I talked to. I did not tell my wife, did not share with my pastor, did not see any counselors. It was my problem, mine and God's, and I just asked him over and over to take care of it. Get rid of it. Take this from me. Take my burden. And was angry at him because he didn't. We became more distant. I continued to try to perform in my life, yet suffering greatly from the shame and the guilt of the acting out sexually.
We had our first son, our son, and then I was busy with him, and almost right away, within a little over a year, I got pregnant with our daughter. And so I became very busy with kids and got distracted and was always, taking care of a toddler and a new baby. And at that point, we started to drift apart, but I just thought it was because I was busy with the kids. He was working and I was doing the stay-at-home mom thing, and I just thought it was kind of natural that we would kind of drift a little because I was so busy and distracted with the kids.
That, about 7 years into our marriage, turned into, it moved from just a inner struggle to an emotional relationship with a woman I worked with, and that then turned into a physical affair with a woman I worked with. Was still a private thing. In the heat of that affair, for the first time in my life, I really did consider suicide. I did not like the two different people that I had become.
Your passion that beats for Christ alone. Your passion.
My kids were healthy and beautiful, had a lovely wife. We had just moved to a new home. I was asked to serve on the elder board at a growing church, and one of the most shameful moments of my life was in that moment when I was asked to be on the elder board, because I was not qualified. I knew that. I knew that I did not make the qualifications, yet I could not say no, because if I had said no to the men that I had shared only half of my life with, they would have asked me why. And at that point, I had a choice: either continue to lie or tell the truth. And I chose continuing to lie.
I started to sense a distance, but never really paid much attention to it. I almost lived in denial that there could be something wrong. He was working, he was doing his job, he was providing for us. And I needed to let that be what he did. And I then turned and started focusing back on the kids and stayed busy with them.
And I was still caught up in these shame cycles, yet vowing to never tell anyone about the truth inside me, that I struggled with my sexuality and struggled with the secrets that I had really kept for years.
Shortly after that, I discovered him on the internet for the first time looking at pornography. And we talked about it, and he committed to, meeting with a friend, talking, getting some accountability. And so I'm like, okay. And I trusted that because I didn't know anything. I was naive to all of it. And then a few months later, actually quite a few months later, I caught him again on the internet. And at that point, it was time to either get help or he had to leave because I didn't like how it felt. I didn't know anything, but my instinct, my gut said, this just isn't right. It didn't feel, all I can say, it was an instinct, a gut thing that said, we've got to do something, and it's got to be drastic.
I wanted to be free, yet I had so much fear inside of me. And my wife, at that time, had walked in on me viewing pornography and had asked that I do something about it. And this was many months before the time of disclosure. There were actually 2 times that she had discovered me viewing pornography. The first time, her response was, I don't know what that is, and please take care of that. And my response was, it's something something I haven't shared with you that I do struggle with, yet I want to be healed from it. And so I will take care of that. And I found a friend who I knew was safe because he too struggled and he wouldn't out me. And we started working through a book together. Every week I showed up. He had not read the chapter I had. And it just didn't last that long. But it was enough to get my wife off my back and believe that, maybe something had changed, until several months later when the second time she walked in while I was viewing pornography. And at that point, in a moment of tremendous courage, inspired by God, she came to me and said, I want you to make a choice. Either we get help or you leave. And it is that moment of courage from her that really started the journey of freedom that God has brought me on.
It was very hurtful. Some dreams of that perfect man started to fall apart. I started to believe that I wasn't enough for him. And then there was a side of it where I think I was in denial. I honestly didn't understand, didn't know. I was very naive to pornography and just all of what went with that, the fantasy and everything else.
We went to see one of our pastors, our counseling pastor at the church. He asked if I wanted to be free, and I absolutely did, yet I did not want to tell all my secrets. I wanted to be free, but I don't want you to know all this. And he started in with a line of questions asking me to tell the truth, and I did, yet I was conniving and dancing and, certainly not being forthright with what my past had looked like. My wife, Heidi, was distraught. She was, her heart was hurt greatly. She was crying. It was a very difficult hour. Yet when we left, I was certainly lighter, but I had taken my burden and thrown it on her, and my heart hurt. And in those moments, and that first time, that first disclosure, I told the truth about my fantasy and the pornography and masturbation part. I did not share with our pastor that I had had an affair. And for me, the difference, even though I knew that my behavior was atrocious and that she certainly could choose to leave me from that, because she didn't know about the physical affair, I held out hope that she wouldn't leave, because she certainly doesn't know that she has really grounds supported biblically and by people around her, that I just need help. We can just fix this and we can move on.
That day, when our pastor started asking questions, really started going after Bob, finding out what was going on, my whole world fell apart. I learned things about my husband I never knew, I realized I actually never knew this man I had married. He was somebody completely different than I had ever known, and I had known him for so many years.
Fortunately, God had more, and he was not going to let go. And in his relentless pursuit of me and pursuit of my heart, the truth of the physical affair came out. And that betrayal, actually, that it was the same day, it was that night that I shared that with her. We described it as the Twin Towers. That second one was burning. I could see it. I knew it was going to fall just like the first one fell. And at that time, we were devastated. Our marriage, in my mind, was over. And I was sure that now that the truth was out, that my life would never be the same. And fortunately, it never has been.
In that learning about this new man or hearing who he was, I became so devastated and I began to shut down. I turned off. I wouldn't allow myself to feel right away. I just was shocked and stunned, and I just almost couldn't function when I started hearing everything that I heard. It was so painful. I can't even allow myself to go back there because it was so painful. And then after we left the pastor's office, I sensed again in my gut that gut came back and said, something's still not right, something's missing. And through that afternoon, I started pursuing Bob and saying, what's missing? You danced around something. I don't know it all. My gut says there is something more. And it was later that afternoon that he shared his affair. And that was the last blow. And I was really unable to function for a few days. I barely got out of bed, and I just tried to do the best I could with my kids, but I couldn't even be there for them. I just really shut down. And I just prayed for God to take me home. The pain was so great. It was time to just go. I'd never considered suicide, but boy, did I really want to go home. I just didn't want to stay here and feel the pain anymore.
Your passion that beats for Christ alone. Your passion.
A few days after disclosure and just being numb, I started to come out of it a bit, and I'm like, okay, we need to figure out what to do. Is it him leaving? Is it staying, getting help? What does it look like? And I went back to our pastor, and we started meeting with him on a weekly basis, trying to figure out, is this a marriage that we're really going to fight for, or is this just too far? It's just gone too far, and there's just no saving it. And then we started seeing a counselor at the same time, and we were just asked, I believe, all the right questions. I think God guided everything in the questions that were asked, and it became very clear very quickly that this was a marriage that was worth saving.
At that point, I started a journey of learning to tell the truth, learning not to be an addict, and learning not to lie. The experience over what's now been 5 years, the experience has been one of being able to share my depravity as well as my dignity. I look at the first 15 years of our marriage, and I never had a hard time sharing my dignity with my wife and offering that to her. But the other side of me, my flesh side, my depravity, is something that I've always struggled with sharing. And there was a secret part of that, a hidden part that I certainly, my behavior was such that I did not share that. And I've learned how to tell the truth and how to share that and to be loved and accepted by my wife, by by God, by other people, even with my depravity, to be in a safe place and be accepted has been really the grace, the mercy of God that I've experienced.
We were probably between 9 and 12 months into recovery, and Bob shared that he had slipped and started looking at pornography again. And we started working through that with our counselor, and I was struggling, is this really, again, is this worth fighting for? Is this going to be a constant battle? And, he recommitted to working hard, and at that time I also started to understand my, I want to say co-addiction, or I was a co-addict in that I was so codependent on my husband that I couldn't be okay until he was okay. And that all started to play out, and it started to force me to start looking at my own garbage, my own stuff. And as I started to do that, the focus on Bob started to shift. I wasn't as focused on whether he was going to do all the right things or not. And then a few months later, after that, I found out that he had slipped again. And I went into the counselor's office. I called, and we got in that day, and I said, I'm done. I can't do this anymore. I want out. Even though I was starting to work on my own side of things, I can't do this if he's still going to keep hurting me every few months. I can't live through that pain. And one of the wisest things that our counselor said to me was, God hasn't finished with you yet in this marriage. Your work here is not done. And I'm going to call you to stay here and continue to work and listen for God to release you, and listen to the people who you are walking with, the pastor, myself, people who are close to you in this recovery. And if they start to believe and start telling you that it's time, and you hear from God that it's time to leave, then you can go. But I'm really going to call you to stay because your work here is not done. And that shifted my mindset in that moment. And I'm like, okay, what do you have in this, God? Let's go. I need you to really lead this, or tell me to walk away. And I never got that walk away message.
The healing moments of my story have come through relationship and through also telling the truth and being known. When others have not run away, and when others have come and opened their hearts when I've opened mine. And we've been able to walk together down a road of really seeing that God's the only one that can heal these wounds. I have done a lot of work in 12 steps for the recovery from addiction. Done a lot of work in story, and telling my own story, and walking with other men in story. Also have began just in the last year working with couples, with my wife and I, in story and in healing with other couples. And that's been incredibly gracious for God to bring that as a part of our story as well.
We tried 12-step programs. We did those together. We did workshops. We did, each of us did our own workshop, and then we did a workshop together. We just started down the road of this journey, and it became very clear that this is a journey. It's not an event, that our lives are different, and we will always be in recovery, and it's a journey, and we need to just keep doing the next thing that comes before us.
Pure passion that beats for Christ alone.
We just heard a story that demonstrates the truth of the verse that says, when we walk in the light as He is in the light, we have fellowship with one another. Heidi had every right to leave Bob. Biblically, she would have had justification. But there is a higher law in the Scriptures that she chose to model her actions from. It's the law of love. It keeps hoping, keeps reaching out, keeps forgiving, even when the person seems wholly unforgivable. It's what Jesus did from the cross. He forgave those who were in the midst of sinning against Him. And the power of that love overcame the power of evil. And what looked to be a disaster became an opportunity to choose the higher law of love. Every case is different, of course, but what a powerful demonstration of what God can do. I hope it has blessed you today and given you new hope for the difficult circumstances that you may be facing. That's what we hope to do every week with Pure Passion, so tune in next week for another message of hope and healing.
The verse in Proverbs of the doe of your youth really became true in what I experienced in my wife.
We have really fallen in love with each other again.
Suddenly, she was more beautiful and attractive to me than she ever had been.
Women need to know they're not alone in this. They're not the only one.
I love her more today than I did yesterday, and I look forward to every day, every new day with her.